The gunshot that took half of James Dalton's hearing in the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862 changed more than just the way he heard the world. It changed the way he moved through it, always turning his right ear toward conversations, toward danger, toward life itself. 6 years later, in the summer of 1868, he stood on the dusty main street of Salvation, New Mexico Territory, watching a woman with copper-colored hair struggle with a trunk that looked twice her size outside the stagecoach depot. And he did not hear her call for help the first time because she stood on his left side. Elena Fitzgerald had traveled from St. Louis with nothing but that trunk, a letter of employment as a schoolteacher, and the desperate hope that distance could heal what grief had broken. Her brother had died in the war, her father had followed him to the grave 2 years later from a broken heart, and her mother had passed just this spring from pneumonia. At 23 years old, Elena had buried everyone she loved and decided that a fresh start in the untamed West was better than slowly dying in a house full of ghosts. She called out again, louder this time, and finally the tall cowboy with the sun-weathered face and startlingly blue eyes turned toward her. "I apologize, ma'am," James said, touching the brim of his hat as he approached. "I did not hear you. Could you help me with this trunk?" Elena asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. The New Mexico sun bore down mercilessly, and her traveling dress clung to her with perspiration. "I need to get it to the boarding house." James lifted the trunk as though it weighed nothing, muscles flexing beneath his worn cotton shirt. "Where are you headed?" "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Elena said. "I am the new schoolteacher." "That is just down the street," James said, but when Elena stepped to his left to walk beside him, he shifted uncomfortably, moving the trunk to his other hand so she ended up on his right. Elena noticed but said nothing, following his lead as they walked past the general store, the saloon, and the marshal's office. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour on her apron, bustled out to greet them. "You must be Miss Fitzgerald," she said warmly. "And I see James has already found you. That man is always helping someone." James set the trunk down gently on the porch. "Welcome to Salvation, Miss Fitzgerald," he said, and when he tipped his hat again, Elena caught sight of a scar that ran from his left temple back toward his ear, partially hidden by his dark hair. "Thank you, mister." Elena paused, realizing she did not know his name. Dalton, James Dalton. He met her eyes for just a moment, and Elena felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat. Then he was gone, striding back down the street with a slight limp she had not noticed before. "James is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said as she led Elena inside. "He runs a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. Lost his hearing in one ear during the war, the left one, I think. Cannon fire or some such. He does not talk about it much, but he has been different since he came back. Quieter. Keeps to himself mostly, except when someone needs help." Elena settled into her room, a small but clean space with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. She had 3 days before school started, 3 days to prepare lessons and learn the names of her students and figure out how to build a life in this place that felt like the edge of the world. That evening, she took dinner in Mrs. Patterson's dining room with the other boarders, a banker named Mr. Giles, a widow named Mrs. Crawford, and a young married couple, the Thompsons, who ran the general store. They were friendly and curious, asking about her journey and her qualifications, and Elena answered as best she could while her mind kept drifting back to the cowboy with the scarred ear and the careful way he had positioned himself, so she stood on his right. The next morning, Elena walked to the schoolhouse to take inventory of her supplies. The building was small, just one room with benches for the students and a desk for her at the front. Someone had left a slate and chalk, a few worn primers, and a Bible. It was not much, but Elena had expected as much. She spent the morning cleaning, sweeping out dust and chasing a family of mice from the corner, and she was just finishing when she heard footsteps on the porch. James Dalton stood in the doorway with a crate in his arms. "I brought some books," he said. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might need supplies." Elena felt her heart skip again. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Dalton." "Just James," he said, setting the crate on her desk. Elena moved to his right side without thinking about it, drawn by some instinct she could not name, and James seemed to relax slightly. "What kind of books?" Elena asked, looking through the crate. There were McGuffey readers, a geography primer, a mathematics text, and several volumes of poetry. "They belonged to my sister," James said quietly. "She passed away from scarlet fever 10 years ago. She would have wanted them used." "I am so sorry," Elena said, touching his arm without thinking. James looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and for a moment neither of them moved. "I should get back to the ranch," James said finally, but he did not pull away from her touch. "If you need anything else, just ask Mrs. Patterson. She knows how to reach me." "Thank you, James," Elena said softly, and she thought she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks before he turned and left. Over the next several days, Elena saw James 3 more times in town, once at the general store, once outside the church, and once at the livery stable when she inquired about renting a horse to ride out to visit some of the ranch families with children who would be attending school. Each time, she found herself naturally gravitating to his right side, and each time, James seemed to notice and appreciate it without saying a word. School started on a Monday morning in September when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken. Elena had 23 students ranging from age 6 to 15, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and the few farmers who had managed to coax crops from the dry land. She loved them immediately, their curiosity, their energy, their hunger for learning. By the end of the first week, she knew all their names and most of their stories. One of her students was a quiet 10-year-old boy named Thomas Dalton. He had James's blue eyes and dark hair, and Elena's heart stuttered when he introduced himself. "Is James Dalton your father?" She asked gently after class one day. Thomas shook his head. "My uncle. My parents died when I was a baby. Uncle James has raised me since I came back from the war." "You are lucky to have him," Elena said, and Thomas nodded seriously. "He is the best man I know," the boy said. "He taught me to ride and rope and read. He says reading is just as important as ranching." Elena found herself thinking about James constantly, the way he moved through the world with quiet competence, the way he had given her his sister's books, the way he was raising his nephew alone. She wanted to know more about him, wanted to understand the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes. Her opportunity came 2 weeks later when Thomas mentioned that his uncle's birthday was approaching. "He never celebrates it," Thomas said sadly. "He says birthdays are not important." "But I think everyone deserves a birthday cake." Elena made a decision. On Saturday afternoon, she baked a chocolate cake using Mrs. Patterson's kitchen and borrowed Mr. Thompson's horse and wagon to drive out to the Dalton ranch. She had gotten directions from Mrs. Patterson, who had smiled knowingly and said, "It is about time someone paid that man some attention." The ranch sat in a valley surrounded by red rock formations, with a modest house, a barn, and corrals where horses grazed. Elena drove up the dusty road with her heart pounding, wondering if she was being too forward, if James would think her visit inappropriate. James emerged from the barn as she pulled up, wiping his hands on his pants. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Miss Fitzgerald, is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Elena said, climbing down from the wagon with the cake carefully balanced. "Thomas mentioned it was your birthday, and I thought you might like some cake." James stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could not read the expression on his face. Then slowly he smiled, a real smile that transformed his features and made him look younger, less burdened. "I cannot remember the last time someone made me a birthday cake," he said quietly. "Then it is long overdue," Elena said, and she made sure to walk on his right side as they went into the house. The inside was neat and spare, with handmade furniture and a few personal touches, a quilt on the back of the sofa, books on a shelf, A photograph of a young woman who must have been James's sister. James cut the cake while Elena looked around, and they sat at his kitchen table eating and talking while the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. "Tell me about the war," Elena said gently. "Only if you want to." James was quiet for a long time, and Elena thought he might not answer. Then he set down his fork and looked at her with those startlingly blue eyes. "I was at Glorieta Pass in 1862. Confederate forces were trying to push into New Mexico territory, and we were trying to stop them. There was a battle, and I was too close to a cannon when it fired. The sound was like the world ending. When I woke up, my left ear was bleeding, and I could not hear anything from that side. The surgeon said I was lucky it was just my hearing and not my life." "I am sorry you had to go through that," Elena said, reaching across the table to take his hand. James looked down at their joined hands, his calloused fingers rough against her smooth ones. "There are men who lost much more," he said. "I learned to adapt. I just have to be careful about positioning myself so I can hear. It is why I always move to put people on my right side." "I noticed," Elena said softly. "I have been trying to remember to stand there." James looked up at her, and the gratitude in his eyes made Elena's throat tight. "You have no idea how much that means to me," he said. "Most people do not notice, or if they do not care enough to adjust. They just get frustrated when I ask them to repeat things." "I care," Elena said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They talked until the sun began to set, about his ranch and her teaching, about their families and their losses. James told her about his sister who had dreamed of being a teacher like Elena. Elena told him about her brother who had died at Antietam and the way her parents had never recovered from the loss. "We are both survivors," James said finally. "Trying to build something good from the pieces that are left." "Yes," Elena said. "Exactly that." When she drove back to town as darkness fell, Elena felt lighter than she had in years. There was something between her and James, something real and solid and worth exploring. She could feel it in the way he had looked at her, in the way he had held her hand, in the way he had smiled when she remembered to stay on his right side. Over the following weeks, James began coming to town more often. He would stop by the schoolhouse to pick up Thomas, and he would linger to talk with Elena about her lessons and her students. He brought her firewood as autumn set in and the nights grew cold. He fixed a broken window latch and repaired a loose board on the steps. He never said much, but his actions spoke volumes. Elena found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her. She would watch for him from the schoolhouse window, her heart lifting when she saw him ride up on his big bay horse. She made excuses to walk by the general store when she knew he would be picking up supplies. She attended church every Sunday even though she had never been particularly devout, because she knew James would be there with Thomas. Mrs. Patterson noticed, of course. "That man is sweet on you," she told Elena one evening over supper, "and you are just as sweet on him. You should invite him to dinner." "Would that be proper?" Elena asked, blushing. "Proper enough," Mrs. Patterson said with a laugh. "This is the frontier, dear girl, not a St. Louis drawing room. If you like him, let him know." So Elena gathered her courage, and the next time James stopped by the schoolhouse, she asked him to dinner at the boarding house on Saturday evening. James's face lit up like a sunrise. "I would like that very much," he said, and Elena felt warmth flood through her chest. Saturday evening arrived, and Elena wore her best dress, a dark blue silk that brought out the auburn in her hair. She had helped Mrs. Patterson prepare a meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans, and apple pie, and she had set the table in the private dining room that Mrs. Patterson used for special occasions. James arrived exactly on time, clean-shaven and wearing what was clearly his best shirt and vest. He had brought wildflowers, a bouquet of golden asters and purple sage that he must have ridden out to collect. "These are for you," he said, handing them to Elena with a shy smile. "They are beautiful," Elena said, burying her face in them to hide her own smile. "Thank you. Dinner was perfect." They talked and laughed, and Elena made sure to sit on James's right at the table. Mrs. Patterson served them and then tactfully disappeared, leaving them alone. As the evening wore on, Elena felt the connection between them growing stronger, felt the air thicken with possibility. "I have not felt this happy in a long time," James said as they finished their pie. "Not since before the war. You make me remember what it is like to hope for something." "You make me feel the same way," Elena said, reaching for his hand across the table. "I came to salvation to escape my grief, but I found something better. I found you." James stood and came around the table, pulling Elena gently to her feet. They stood close together, so close Elena could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "May I kiss you?" James asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Elena whispered, and when his lips met hers it felt like coming home. They courted properly after that, though everyone in town already knew they were in love. James took Elena on picnics in the Red Rock Canyons, where they would sit and talk for hours. Elena invited James to the school programs she organized, and he sat in the front row and applauded louder than anyone. They went to church together, to town socials, to barn dances at neighboring ranches. And always, without fail, Elena positioned herself on James's right side, and James looked at her like she hung the moon. 2 months later, on a crisp November evening, James asked Elena to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas was inside doing his homework, and the horses were settling in the barn for the night. "I know I do not have much to offer," James said, taking Elena's hand. "Just a ranch and a nephew and a heart that is half deaf to the world, but what I have is yours if you will take it. Marry me, Elena, build a life with me, let me love you for the rest of my days." Elena felt tears streaming down her face. "You have everything I want," she said, "everything I need." "Yes, James, yes, I will marry you." They were wed in December in the small church in Salvation, with half the town in attendance. Elena wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, and James wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable in its formality. Thomas was the ring-bearer, grinning from ear to ear. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears, and even the stoic Marshall got misty-eyed during the vows. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James pulled Elena close and kissed her deeply, not caring who was watching. Elena stood on her toes to reach him better, positioning herself slightly to his right even in this moment, and felt his arms tighten around her. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, with music and dancing and more food than 50 people could eat. James danced with Elena, holding her close and whispering in her good ear all the things he loved about her. They danced until their feet ached, and then they climbed into the wagon James had decorated with ribbons and bells and drove out to the ranch that was now Elena's home. The transition to married life was easier than Elena had expected. She continued teaching during the week, boarding in town Monday through Friday so she would not have to make the long ride every day, and spending weekends at the ranch with James and Thomas. It was not a conventional arrangement, but it worked for them. James understood how much teaching meant to Elena, and Elena understood that the ranch was James's livelihood. On the weekends, Elena threw herself into ranch life. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to can vegetables and fruits for the winter, to mend shirts and sew quilts. She learned the names of all the horses and helped Thomas with his chores. She and James would ride out together to check on the cattle, and Elena would stay on his right side, the two of them moving in sync like they had been together for years, instead of months. At night, in the privacy of their bedroom, James would hold Elena close and tell her all the things he had been too shy to say during the day. He told her about the nightmares he still sometimes had from the war, about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many good men had died. He told her about the loneliness of the past 6 years, the way he had convinced himself he would never find someone who could love a broken man. And Elena would stroke his hair and whisper that he was not broken, that his deafness did not make him less, that she loved every part of him, including the scars. Elena told James about her own ghosts, about the nights she still woke up expecting to hear her mother's voice calling her for breakfast, about the guilt she felt for leaving St. Louis and the graves of everyone she had loved. James held her through those confessions, his strong arms a shelter against the pain of memory. Winter in New Mexico territory was cold but beautiful, the red rocks dusted with snow, the air crisp and clean. Elena taught her students about geography and history, while the pot-bellied stove kept the schoolhouse warm. James and Thomas kept the ranch running, feeding the livestock and repairing fences and preparing for spring. In February, Elena discovered she was pregnant. She told James on a Sunday morning as they sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, the winter sun streaming through the windows. James's face went through a series of emotions: shock, wonder, joy, fear. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice shaking. "As certain as I can be," Elena said, reaching for his hand. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said, pulling her into his arms. "You have given me everything, Elena, everything." Elena continued teaching through the spring, though she knew she would have to give it up once the baby came. The school board was understanding, promising to find a temporary replacement while still holding her position when she was ready to return. The women of Salvation rallied around her, giving her advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and offering to help when the time came. The baby was born on a hot August afternoon in 1869, with Mrs. Patterson acting as midwife and James pacing nervously outside the bedroom. It was a long labor, and there were moments when Elena thought she might not survive it. But finally, after hours of pain, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her son's first cry. James burst into the room the moment Mrs. Patterson allowed it, his face streaked with tears. Elena placed the tiny, red-faced baby in his arms, and James looked down at his son with such overwhelming love that Elena started crying all over again. "What should we name him?" James asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Robert," Elena said softly, "after my brother." "If that is all right with you." "It is perfect," James said, bending to kiss Elena's forehead. "Robert James Dalton, our son." Motherhood transformed Elena in ways she had not anticipated. She had always loved children. It was why she became a teacher. But loving her own child was different, fiercer, more all-consuming. She spent hours just watching Robert sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his face scrunched up when he was hungry. James was a devoted father, getting up in the night to bring the baby to Elena for feeding, rocking Robert back to sleep, singing soft lullabies in his rough cowboy voice. Thomas adored his new cousin, helping with chores without being asked so that James and Elena could rest. At 16, he was becoming a man, tall and strong and capable. James had taught him well, and Elena could see the pride in her husband's eyes when he watched Thomas work. Elena took a year away from teaching to focus on Robert, but she missed the schoolhouse more than she expected. When Robert was old enough, she made arrangements to bring him with her to town during the week, setting up a cradle in the corner of the schoolroom where he could sleep while she taught. The students loved having a baby in the classroom, and the Mothers of Salvation took turns watching Robert when Elena needed to focus on a difficult lesson. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered under James's careful management. Elena's school thrived, with more families moving to the area and enrolling their children. Thomas grew into a fine young man, eventually courting and marrying a sweet girl named Sarah from a neighboring ranch. Robert grew from a baby into a toddler, then a little boy who followed his father everywhere and begged for his own horse. Through it all, Elena never forgot to stand on James's right side. It became second nature, as automatic as breathing. When they walked together, she was always on his right. When they sat together, she positioned herself so he could hear her easily. When they rode out to check the cattle, she kept her horse on his right, and James never took it for granted. He thanked her with his eyes, with gentle touches, with whispered words of love. 5 years after Robert's birth, Elena had a daughter. They named her Grace, and she had Elena's copper hair and James's blue eyes. 2 years after that came another son, Samuel, who was quiet and thoughtful like his father. Thomas and Sarah had children of their own, 2 girls who called James Grandpa James, and climbed all over him like he was a human jungle gym. The years passed in a blur of school programs and roundups, birthdays and holidays, quiet moments and loud celebrations. Elena watched the lines deepen around James's eyes, saw a silver thread through his dark hair. Her own face showed the passage of time, but she did not mind. Every wrinkle was earned through laughter or worry or love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, James took Elena back to the spot where he had proposed, the porch of the ranch house where they had watched the sunset so many years before. The children were grown now. Robert was 19 and helping run the ranch. Grace was 15 and talking about becoming a teacher like her mother. Samuel was 13 and obsessed with horses. Thomas and Sarah had their own spread a few miles away, their daughters nearly grown. 20 years, James said, pulling Elena close as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. 20 years since you agreed to marry a deaf cowboy with more scars than sense. Best decision I ever made, Elena said, leaning her head on his shoulder. She was on his right side, as always, close enough that he could hear every word. You gave me a life, James, a family, a home. You gave me the same, James said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I was just surviving before you came to salvation. You taught me how to live again. They stood together in the fading light, 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. The ranch spread out before them, solid and prosperous. Inside the house, they could hear Grace playing the piano that James had bought for her birthday, Samuel arguing with Robert about something inconsequential, the sounds of a family secure in their love for each other. Do you ever regret leaving St. Louis? James asked softly. Not for a single moment, Elena said, turning to look up at her husband. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hair mostly silver now, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. This is where I was always meant to be, with you, on your good side. Close enough to hear your heart beat. James smiled, that same smile that had transformed his face the first time she brought him a birthday cake, and bent to kiss her. 20 years of kisses, and it still felt like the first one, still made Elena's heart race and her knees weak. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge in the vast New Mexico sky, they went inside to join their children. Elena made coffee while James helped Grace with a difficult section of music. Robert and Samuel set the table for a late supper. The house was full of noise and love and life. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Elena and James sat together on the sofa, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They did not need words. They had said everything that needed saying over 20 years of marriage, through joy and sorrow, through easy times and hard. Elena thought back to that day in 1868 when she had stepped off the stagecoach in Salvation, alone and grieving and desperate for a fresh start. She had been so broken then, so certain that the best parts of her life were behind her. She could never have imagined that a deaf cowboy with a scarred ear and a gentle heart would become her whole world. James shifted slightly, and Elena automatically adjusted her position to stay on his right side to stay close. After 20 years, it was instinct muscle memory, a physical manifestation of her love. And James, as he always did, tightened his arm around her in silent gratitude. I love you, Elena whispered into the comfortable darkness. I love you too, James whispered back. Always. The years continued to unfold with a gentle predictability that Elena had come to treasure. Robert married a rancher's daughter named Margaret when he was 21, and they built a house on the far side of the Dalton property. Grace did indeed become a teacher, taking over Elena's position at the Salvation Schoolhouse when Elena finally decided to retire at 50. Samuel, who had inherited his father's quiet competence with horses, started a breeding program that became known throughout the territory. Thomas and Sarah's daughters married and started families of their own. And suddenly, James and Elena were great-aunt and great-uncle, a development that made them both laugh and feel impossibly old. The ranch that James had built with his own hands now supported 3 generations, with more on the way. Elena had never imagined such abundance. Coming from loss, having buried everyone she loved before she was 24, the sheer number of people who called her family sometimes overwhelmed her. Thanksgiving dinners required 3 tables pushed together. Christmas meant dozens of presents under the tree. Summer meant children running wild through the property, their laughter echoing off the red rocks. Through it all, James remained her constant. He moved slower now, his war injuries catching up with him as he aged. The leg that had been wounded at Glorietta Pass ached in cold weather. His deaf ear sometimes rang with phantom sounds that made him wince. But he still rose every morning before dawn, still checked on the livestock, still kissed Elena like she was the most precious thing in his world, and Elena still stood on his right side, still stayed close. It had become so natural over the decades that she barely thought about it anymore. But James noticed. He always noticed. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with such tenderness in his blue eyes that it made her breath catch, even after 30 years of marriage. On a spring morning in 1898, James and Elena rode out together to their favorite spot, a mesa overlooking the valley where the ranch spread out like a patchwork quilt. James was 70 now, Elena 68, and neither of them rode as easily as they once had. But they still made this journey several times a year, needing the quiet and the view and the reminder of how far they had come. "Do you remember the first time I brought you out here?" James asked as they sat on the flat rock where they always rested. Elena was on his right, close enough that their legs touched. "You packed a picnic," Elena said, smiling at the memory. "Cold chicken and biscuits and strawberry preserves. It was about a month after we started courting." "I was so nervous," James admitted. "I kept thinking you would realize you could do better than a half-deaf cowboy and run back to St. Louis." "I was already in love with you by then," Elena said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I think I started falling in love the moment you shifted that trunk so I would end up on your right side. You never made me feel like an inconvenience, James. You made me feel seen." "You did the same for me," James said quietly. "Do you know how rare that is? Most people do not have the patience for my condition. They get frustrated having to repeat themselves, or they just stop trying to include me in conversations. But you never did that. From the very first day, you adapted. You made space for me in your world." "Because I wanted you there," Elena said simply. "I still do. I always will." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The spring grass was green and thick after good winter rains, and wildflowers dotted the landscape. Elena could see Robert's house in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. Margaret would be making breakfast for their 4 children. Grace was probably already at the schoolhouse, preparing for the day's lessons. Samuel would be in the stables, talking softly to his beloved horses. "We built something good," James said, following her gaze. "Something that will last." "We did," Elena agreed. "Together." As they rode back to the main house, moving slowly to spare their aging bones, Elena felt a deep sense of contentment. Her life had not turned out anything like she had planned when she was a young girl in St. Louis. It had been harder in some ways, easier in others, and infinitely richer than she could have imagined. She had found love in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person. A cowboy who could not hear from one ear, who positioned himself carefully to catch every word, who had trusted her enough to let her into his guarded heart. And she had learned to stand on his good side, to stay close, not because he needed her to, but because she wanted to. Because love was not just grand gestures and passionate declarations. It was also small, daily considerations. It was remembering which side to stand on. It was staying close even when it would be easier to drift apart. That summer, the entire family gathered to celebrate James's birthday. It had become a tradition over the years, a massive party with food and music and too many people crammed into too small a space. This year, James turned 70, and Elena had baked him the same chocolate cake she had brought to his ranch 30 years before. "You are going to have to tell me your secret," Margaret said, watching Elena frost the cake. "You and Father James have the strongest marriage I have ever seen. How did you make it work?" Elena thought about the question as she smoothed the chocolate frosting. "We chose each other," she said finally. "Every single day we chose each other. And I learned early on to meet him where he was, not where I wanted him to be. James has always been exactly who he is, honest, hardworking, kind, and yes, deaf in one ear. I never tried to change him. I just made space for him in my life, and he did the same for me." "It sounds simple when you say it like that," Margaret said. "The concept is simple," Elena said with a smile. "The execution takes a lifetime of practice." The party was a joyous chaos of children and grandchildren and great-nieces and great-nephews. James sat in his favorite chair, holding his newest great-grandnephew, a 6-month-old baby named James in his honor. Elena watched from across the room, her heart full to bursting. Grace appeared at her elbow, handing her a cup of coffee. "You are thinking deep thoughts, Mama." "Just reflecting on how lucky I am," Elena said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I almost did not come to salvation, you know. I had another job offer in California and it paid better. But something told me to come here instead." "Fate," Grace said confidently. "You were meant to find Papa." "Perhaps," Elena said. "Or perhaps I just made a choice that led to other choices that led me to the life I have now. Either way, I am grateful." As the afternoon wore on and the party showed no signs of winding down, James caught Elena's eye from across the room. He tilted his head toward the door, a silent question. Elena nodded and made her way to his right side, always his right side, and they slipped out together. They walked down to the barn, hand in hand, escaping the noise and chaos for a few moments of peace. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horses. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the ranch they had built together. 70 years old, James said, shaking his head. "I never thought I would make it this long. After the war, after losing so much, I did not think I had a future." "But you did," Elena said, squeezing his hand. "We did. Because of you," James said, turning to face her. "You saved me, Elena. You gave me a reason to keep going, to build something, to hope." "You saved me too," Elena said, reaching up to touch his face. The scar near his left ear was faded now, barely visible among the wrinkles of age. "We saved each other." James pulled her close, and they stood there in the barn doorway. Two old people who had loved each other through 30 years of marriage, through war and loss and hardship and joy. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, positioning herself on his right side even in this embrace, and felt his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. "You hear them?" James asked softly, tilting his head toward the house where the sounds of the party drifted on the summer breeze. "Yes," Elena said, "I hear them." "That is our legacy," James said, "not the ranch or the land or the money, the family we built, the love we shared, that is what will last." "Yes," Elena said again, feeling tears prick her eyes, "that is what will last." They returned to the party eventually, to the laughter and the chaos and the cake that had become a tradition. James blew out 70 candles with help from the youngest grandchildren, and everyone sang and cheered. Elena stood beside him on his right side, close enough to hear him whisper, "Best birthday ever." The years continued their inexorable march. James began to slow down more noticeably, handing over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Robert while he focused on the breeding program with Samuel. Elena's joints ached with arthritis, making it harder to ride out to the mesa, but she still managed it a few times a year because those moments alone with James were too precious to give up. They lost friends and neighbors to age and illness. They attended funerals and comforted the grieving and were reminded of their own mortality. But they also welcomed new babies into the world, attended weddings, celebrated anniversaries. Life was a constant cycle of loss and renewal, and they had learned to appreciate both. On a winter evening in 1903, as snow dusted the red rocks and turned the ranch into a Christmas card, Elena and James sat by the fire in their parlor. Robert's family was visiting, and the house was full of noise and warmth. But for this moment, Elena and James were alone, Robert having taken the children out to the barn to see a new foal. "Do you remember that first winter?" Elena asked, watching the flames dance. "When I was still teaching and only coming home on weekends." "I counted the days until Friday," James said, his hand finding hers. "The ranch felt empty without you." "I felt the same way in town," Elena said. "Mrs. Patterson used to tease me about how I would stare out the window watching for you to ride in." "I always came as early as I could," James said with a smile. "Could not stay away." They were quiet for a moment, lost in memories. Then James said, "Elena, I need to tell you something." Something in his tone made Elena's heart skip. "What is it?" "I have been having pain," James said slowly. "In my chest. The doctor says my heart is weak. He says I might not have much time left." Elena felt the world tilt. "How long?" "He cannot say for certain," James said. "Could be months. Could be a year or two if I am lucky, but not much more than that." Elena closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She had known this day would come eventually. They were both in their 70s, after all, but she had not been prepared for it to come so soon. "What do? We keep living," James said firmly. "We do not waste what time we have on fear or regret. We spend it with our family, we spend it with each other, we make every day count." "I cannot lose you," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "You will never lose me," James said, pulling her close. "I will always be with you, Elena, in every sunrise over the mesa. In every lesson Grace teaches at the schoolhouse. In every horse Samuel trains. In every choice Robert makes for the ranch, I will be there." Elena let herself cry then, pressing her face into James's shoulder while he held her and stroked her hair. She had lost so many people in her life, her brother, her parents, friends, and neighbors over the years. But the thought of losing James, her partner of 35 years, her other half, was almost more than she could bear. "Promise me something," James said after her tears had subsided. "Anything," Elena said. "Promise me you will keep living after I am gone," James said. "Keep teaching if you want to. Keep riding out to the mesa. Keep being part of this family we built. Do not let my death be the end of your story." "I promise," Elena said, though the words felt like shards of glass in her throat. "But you have to promise me something too." "What is that?" "Promise me you will fight," Elena said fiercely. "Promise me you will not give up. I want every day, every hour, every minute that we can have together." "I promise," James said, and he sealed the vow with a kiss. James kept his promise. He fought for 2 more years, refusing to let his failing heart stop him from living. He still rose early most mornings, though he did not work as hard as he once had. He still rode out to check on the cattle, though Robert insisted on going with him. He still kissed Elena every morning and every night, still made sure she was on his right side, still loved her with every fiber of his being. Elena kept her promise too. She did not waste time on fear. She treasured every moment they had together, from the mundane to the extraordinary. She learned to appreciate the quiet mornings drinking coffee together, the evenings by the fire, the way James still held her hand like they were young lovers instead of old people facing the end. They told the family about James's condition, not wanting to keep secrets. Robert took it hard, and Elena spent an evening holding her grown son while he cried for the father who had raised him from infancy. Grace withdrew into herself for a few days before coming to talk to Elena about her fears. Samuel simply spent more time at the main house, helping his father with projects and soaking up his presence while he could. In the spring of 1905, James's condition worsened. He spent most of his days in bed, too weak to do much more than sit in a chair by the window. Elena rarely left his side, reading to him from the books he loved, talking about their life together, holding his hand. On a warm May evening, with the windows open and the smell of spring blowing through the house, James called the family together. They gathered in the bedroom, Robert and Margaret with their children, Grace with her husband Peter, Samuel with his wife Ruth, Thomas and Sarah with their grandchildren. The room was crowded, but no one complained. "I want you all to know how proud I am," James said, his voice weak but clear. He was propped up on pillows and Elena sat beside him on the bed, his hand clasped in both of hers. "You have all grown into fine people. You have built good lives, raised good families. You have taken what I taught you and made it your own. That is all a father could ask for." There were tears all around, but everyone smiled through them. Robert clasped his father's shoulder, Grace kissed his forehead, Samuel held his hand. Thomas, no longer the boy James had raised but a grandfather himself, simply nodded, his eyes wet. "Take care of each other," James continued. "Take care of your mother. She is the strongest person I have ever known, but she is going to need you in the days ahead." "We will, Papa," Grace said, speaking for all of them. After the family left, Elena climbed into bed beside James, something the doctor had warned against but which she did not care about anymore. She needed to be close to him, needed to feel his warmth while she still could. "Thank you," James whispered into the darkness. "For 37 years of happiness, for learning to stand on my good side, for staying close even when I pushed everyone else away, for loving me when I did not think I deserved to be loved." "You always deserved it," Elena said, her voice thick with tears. "You were always worthy of love, James. From the very first moment I saw you." "Promise me again," James said. "Promise me you will keep living." "I promise," Elena said, "but you have to promise me something too." "What?" "Wait for me," Elena said. "On the other side, wait for me so we can be together again." "I will wait forever if I have to," James said. "But I hope I do not have to wait that long." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Elena woke in the gray light of dawn, James was gone. She knew before she even opened her eyes, felt his absence like a physical wound. But when she looked at his face, peaceful in death, she saw a hint of that smile she loved, as if his last thoughts had been happy ones. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over the territory to pay their respects. James had touched many lives over his 77 years, and they all came to say goodbye. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple stone marker that read, "James Dalton, 1828 to 1905. Beloved husband, father, and friend, he lived with honor." Elena thought she might die of grief in those first weeks. The house felt empty without James, the bed too big, the mornings too quiet. She moved through the days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done but feeling nothing, but slowly, painfully, she began to heal. The family rallied around her just as James had asked. Robert and Margaret visited daily. Grace came to read to her. Samuel brought her news of the horses, knowing she would want to know. And Thomas, her first son in all but blood, sat with her for hours, sharing memories of the man who had raised them both. Elena kept her promise. She did not let James's death be the end of her story. She started riding again, slowly and carefully, out to the mesa where she and James had spent so many happy hours. She stood at his grave and talked to him, telling him about the family, about the ranch, about the daily minutiae of life without him. She lived for another 12 years, long enough to see great-grandchildren grow into adults, to see the ranch expand and prosper, to see Grace become known as the best teacher in the territory. She lived long enough to know that the legacy she and James had built together would endure. On a summer morning in 1917, Elena died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. She was found with a smile on her face, and on her bedside table was a photograph from her wedding day, her standing on James's right side, close enough to touch, both of them young and in love and full of hope. They buried her next to James on the hill overlooking the ranch. The family gathered once more, 4 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who had been their anchor, their teacher, their example of what love could be. Robert, now 68 himself and silver-haired, stood at the grave after everyone else had left. He looked at the 2 markers side by side, his parents together again after 12 years apart. "Thank you," he said softly, "for loving each other, for loving us." for showing us what a good marriage looks like. He placed wildflowers on both graves, golden asters and purple sage, the same flowers James had brought Elena on their first formal dinner together, and walked back down the hill to where his own grandchildren waited. The ranch continued for generations, the Dalton name becoming synonymous with quality horses and good people. But the real legacy was not the land or the business. It was the love story that had started it all, a deaf cowboy and a schoolteacher from St. Louis who had learned to stand on his good side and stay close, who had built a life together from the broken pieces of their pasts, who had showed everyone around them what it meant to truly love someone. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the mesa, some family members swore they could see two figures on the horizon. A man and a woman, riding side by side, the woman always on the man's right, close enough to touch together for eternity. The story of James and Elena became a legend in Salvation, passed down through generations of Daltons and retold at family gatherings. Great-great-grandchildren who never knew them heard about the cowboy who lost his hearing in the war and the teacher who learned to adapt. They heard about the chocolate birthday cake, the wildflower bouquet, the mesa where two people fell in love. The schoolhouse where Elena taught was eventually renamed the Elena Dalton School, with a plaque commemorating her 40 years of service to the children of Salvation. The ranch that James built with his own hands remained in the family for over a century, a testament to hard work and careful management. But more than the buildings or the land, what lasted was the example James and Elena had set. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren learned from them what it meant to love someone fully, not just the easy parts but the difficult parts too. To meet people where they were, not where you wanted them to be. To make small adjustments in the name of love. To stand on the good side and stay close. In a world that was rapidly changing, with automobiles replacing horses and cities growing where there had once been wilderness, the story of James and Elena remained constant. It was a reminder of a simpler time, yes, but more importantly, it was a reminder of what matters most, not wealth or fame or achievement, but love. The kind of love that notices which ear someone can hear from and adjusts accordingly. The kind of love that brings chocolate cake on birthdays. The kind of love that keeps promises, fights for every moment together and waits on the other side. As the sun set over the red rocks of New Mexico, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink just as it had 100 years before, the ranch bustled with life. Horses grazed in the fields. Children played in the yard. And on the hill overlooking it all, two simple stone markers stood side by side, testament to a love that had built something lasting, something good, something that would never truly end. James and Elena Dalton had started with nothing but hope and found everything worth having. They had been broken by war and grief and loss, and they had healed each other. They had built not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love that would echo through generations. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, a cowboy with a scarred ear and a teacher with copper hair walked together through fields of wildflowers, she on his right side where she belonged, close enough to hear his heartbeat, close enough to know that this was what they had been meant to find all along. Each other, forever. Together, their love story was simple in its way, no grand adventures, no dramatic rescues, just two people choosing each other every day for 37 years. But simplicity does not mean insignificance. In fact, the opposite was true. The simple act of standing on someone's good side, of staying close, of adapting to their needs without resentment or complaint, that was the most profound expression of love there was. And so the story ended as all good love stories should, with two souls united, a family thriving, and the knowledge that some things, like true love, really do last forever. The Wild West was tamed, the frontier settled, but the legacy of James and Elena Dalton remained untamed and wild and free. A reminder to all who came after that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth adapting for, worth everything. The end.